The laughter started on day one. It was not mean laughter, not exactly. It was the kind that escapes through the nose before the brain catches it. Involuntary, helpless, the kind that belongs to creatures who simply cannot believe what they are looking at. Sergeant Dara Okoye stood at parade rest on the tarmac of Forward Operating Base Crucible, on a moon called Thresh that nobody back home had ever heard of, holding her M4A1 carbine across her chest like she always did. Barrel up, the stock down, the way her drill sergeant had screamed into her ear 4 years ago, until the posture became bone memory. Around her, 42 humans stood in the same posture. Same rifles, same boots, same everything. And around them, 300 Vitali soldiers stared. The Vitali were tall, not dramatically tall, not the kind of tall that makes your jaw drop. Just efficient tall. 7 feet of lean, dense muscle under gray-blue skin, and with 4 arms arranged in pairs and eyes that caught light the way mirrors do. They had been fighting wars across 4 star systems for 800 years. Their weapons were pulse emitters the size of a human fist that could reduce a main battle tank to component atoms. Their armor was self-sealing nano mesh that a standard bullet could not penetrate. One of them, a junior officer, young by Vitali standards, and which meant he was probably 60 years old, stepped closer to Okoye and bent at the waist to examine the M4A1. His eyes moved slowly down the barrel, the carrying handle, the iron sights. He said something in Vitali. The translator drone overhead rendered it in flat, emotionless English. "Is this a training weapon?" Okoye did not blink. "Negative." The Vitali officer straightened, said something else. "Is it ceremonial?" "Negative." He looked at her. He looked at the rifle. And he looked back at her. The laughter that came out of him was low and resonant, and it spread through the assembled Vitali formation like a stone dropped in still water. 300 soldiers laughing, not cruel, just incredulous. Like they had been told the new allies showed up to a starship battle in a rowboat, and were only now seeing the rowboat for themselves. Okoye stood still. She had been briefed on this. Colonel Marsh had said it plainly in the hangar the night before. "They're going to laugh. Let them laugh. Don't explain anything. Don't justify anything. Just stand there and let them get it out of their system." He had paused. "And don't tell them about the other thing." Okoye had asked what the other thing was. Marsh had smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes and said, "You'll know when it's time." So she stood. She let them laugh. The Vitali commander was named Velketh, and he was not laughing. He was watching the humans with the careful stillness of a creature who had survived 800 years of wars by reading situations before other people understood what situations were. He watched Okoye's stillness. He watched the way the other 42 humans did not flinch, did not shift weight, did not exchange glances. He watched, and he stored it somewhere behind his mirror eyes, and he said nothing. The joint briefing happened 3 hours later in a structure the Vitali had assembled in 4 minutes. A field command post that unfolded like origami from a cube the size of a refrigerator. The humans had arrived with their own tents. The Vitali found this noteworthy in the way that anthropologists find cave paintings noteworthy. A sign of something older, simpler, and somehow still standing. And the mission was straightforward in the way that only people who have never done it would call straightforward. Thresh's northern continent had a network of tunnels carved by something that was not the current inhabitants, which was already the beginning of a problem. And inside those tunnels lived a faction of Grethali insurgents who had spent the last 14 months collapsing supply lines, assassinating Vitali officers, and disappearing back into the dark. The tunnels were too narrow for standard Vitali pulse equipment, too shielded for orbital strike, too deep for sensor penetration. They needed soldiers who could go in small, move fast, and shoot in close quarters. The Vitali had looked at this problem and requested human infantry. which was why the humans were here, with their ancient bullet-firing rifles, and why the Vithali were still, in the privacy of their own minds, not entirely sure this was going to work. The Velketh laid out the tactical map. The tunnel network spread across the display like a nervous system, branching and doubling back and connecting in ways that seemed almost biological. Entry points were marked in red, known Grethali positions in orange, and in the deep center of the network, at the end of a passage that corkscrewed for 3 kilometers underground, a central command node that, if taken, would unravel every operation the insurgents had left. We estimate 40 to 60 combatants inside, Velketh said, armed with disruption charges and close-range plasma cutters, lethal at 4 meters, ineffective beyond 12. Okoye studied the map. "What's the ceiling height on the main passage?" she asked. Velketh checked. 2 meters. Standard human range. Some side passages lower. She nodded slowly. A Vithali officer named Sher Val, the young one who had laughed at the rifle, leaned toward his colleague and said something quietly. The translator drone caught it. "Their weapons will make a great deal of noise. It will alert every combatant in the network simultaneously." Velketh said, "Yes." "Then they will all die." "Probably." Okoye had heard this exchange. She did not look up from the map. She said, "We go in 12 hours. I want every exit mapped and cross-referenced with seismic data from the last 6 months." Sherval stared at her. "You heard?" "I heard." She tapped the central node on the map. 12 hours. Velketh looked at her for a long moment. That careful, storing stillness. Then he nodded once. Sherval went quiet. The humans spent the next 12 hours doing things the Vithali did not entirely understand. They stripped their rifles down and put them back together in the dark, by feel. They ran loaded without weapons for 2 hours through terrain that nobody had asked them to run through. And they ate ration bars that smelled like compressed sadness and drank water from collapsible bottles and slept in 4-hour shifts on the bare ground without complaint. Okoye spent part of her night sitting outside the tent, cleaning her rifle under a tiny headlamp, and next to her sat a young private named Espinoza, who was 19 years old and had been in the military for 8 months, and had, until 3 weeks ago, never left Earth's atmosphere. He said, "Sarge, do you think the Vithali are right? About the noise thing?" She ran a clean patch through the barrel. "The noise is part of it." He thought about that. "Is that good or bad?" "Depends on which part of the plan you're looking at." He waited for more. She did not give more. He had learned by now that when Okoye said something like that, she meant the conversation was over and he should think about it himself until either he understood it or the mission answered it for him. And he fell asleep wondering. At 0300, something arrived at the base. The Vithali perimeter sensors flagged it first. A large transport, human military markings, coming in low and fast with its running lights off, and attached to its underside in a configuration that made the sensor operator do a very slow double take, was a piece of equipment that the Vithali had no entry for in their entire military database. Sherval was on duty. He stood in front of the sensor screen for a full 30 seconds without speaking. Then he went and got Velketh. Velketh stood in front of the sensor screen for 10 seconds. He said, "Find Sergeant Okoye." Someone went to find Sergeant Okoye. She was already awake. She was standing outside the tent, watching the transport settle onto the far end of the tarmac in a wash of landing lights. And her expression was the expression of someone watching something they ordered finally arrive. Quiet satisfaction. A small and private thing. Espinoza stood next to her, newly awake, rubbing his eyes. He looked at the transport. He looked at what was mounted to it. His mouth opened. He said, "Holy..." Language. "Yes, Sergeant." A pause. "Is that what I think it is?" She said, "Get your kit." Velketh appeared at her shoulder. He looked at the transport for a long time, and he looked at Okoye. His voice, when it came, was very quiet. "What is that?" She turned to look at him. In the landing lights, her expression was unreadable. She said, "That's the other thing." The Vithali soldiers had begun to gather at the edge of the tarmac, drawn by the lights and the sound and the animal instinct that tells soldiers everywhere that something significant is happening, and they should be watching it. They stood in clusters, tall and gray-blue and quiet for the first time since the humans had arrived. The transport's cargo ramp lowered. From inside it, a technical crew in worn coveralls began running power cables, checking connections, performing checks on a piece of machinery that had not existed in this star system until 30 seconds ago. It was not small, it was not subtle, and it was absolutely, definitively not a training weapon. Our Cherval stood at the edge of the crowd and looked at it and felt something he had not felt since his first combat deployment 60 years ago. Something he had not expected to feel on a moon called Thresh, standing next to a species with rifles that looked like museum pieces. He felt uncertain. The technical crew chief, a heavy-set woman with a sunburn and grease under her fingernails, climbed down from the transport, walked to Okoye, and handed her a tablet. "She's calibrated and ready." "A sergeant. Test fire cleared range control." Okoye signed the tablet. "How's the mount?" "Solid. We reinforced the hardpoint. She'll take the torque." "Good." Okoye handed the tablet back. She looked at the gathered Vithali, 300 soldiers who had spent the day laughing at a rifle, and she said, not loudly but clearly enough, "Get some sleep. We move at 0430. She walked back toward the tent. Velketh watched her go. He turned back to the machine on the transport. Or he studied it for a long moment with his mirror eyes and his 800 years of accumulated military knowledge and his careful, storing stillness. Then, very quietly, in Vithali, he said something that the translator drone caught and rendered in flat, emotionless English. "I think I understand now why they were not afraid." The tunnels smelled like iron and old time. Not old the way a basement smells old or a library. Old the way geologists mean it. Deep, mineral, and the breath of rock that has been sealed from sunlight for longer than the human species has been walking upright. It pressed against the skin and settled in the lungs and reminded every cell in the body that it was underground and the ground was heavy. Okoye moved point. Behind her, 8 soldiers, each carrying their M4A1, each moving in the specific silence that gets beaten into infantry through enough training that it stops being discipline and becomes instinct. But Espinosa was 4th in the stack. He had never been in a tunnel combat before. He breathed through his nose, slow and even, the way Okoye had told him, because mouth breathing in tight spaces makes noise, and noise in tight spaces kills you. The Vithali had sent a 4-soldier element to accompany them. Observer status officially, Velketh had insisted. Okoye had agreed on 2 conditions. They stayed back, and they did not give orders. Velketh had agreed without argument, that which had surprised her. Cher Val was one of the 4. He moved behind the human formation with the watchful stillness of a predator that is not currently hunting, but is always capable of it. He was still running the noise calculus in his head, the way he had been running it since the briefing. 40 to 60 insurgents. The moment the first human weapon fired, every single one of them would know exactly where the incursion was. It was a perfect acoustic amplification system, but the tunnels would carry the sound like a telephone wire. He had run this calculation 9 times. Each time the answer was the same. It did not make sense to him that Okoye knew this and was here anyway. So either she was not as intelligent as Velketh seemed to think, or the calculation was missing a variable. He kept walking. He kept watching. They had been moving for 22 minutes when Okoye raised a closed fist. The entire formation stopped. No sound, no shuffle, just stopped. And the way a single organism stops, because they had drilled this until it was below thought. Cherval's second pair of arms tensed. Okoye crouched. She touched the ground. She raised 2 fingers, then 4, pointing forward. 6 combatants. Ahead. Cherval had not heard or smelled anything. He looked at the human next to him, a corporal named Wash, compact and quiet, who he had not heard speak once since the mission began, and Wash was watching forward with the alert, empty calm of someone who has no wasted mental cycles, no decorative thoughts, just assessment and response. The 6 Grathali came around a bend in the tunnel. What happened in the next 4 seconds was something that Cherval would spend a long time trying to describe in his after-action report, and ultimately fail to describe accurately, because language, even in Vithali, which has 43 words for different types of violence, does not have a good word for the specific experience of watching a species fight at effective range in a space so confined that by all tactical logic they should be dying, and instead are not. The rifles were loud. Cherval had expected that. What he had not expected was the precision. What he had not expected was the way each human had a specific lane of fire that did not cross another human's lane. What he had not expected was how fast it was, and how the 4 seconds began with 6 standing Grathali and ended with 6 not standing Grathali, and a stillness that rang in the enclosed space like a struck bell. And then it was over. The humans were already moving forward, stepping through, checking, confirming. No celebration. No pause. Okoye was already looking at her wrist unit, marking the position. Cherval stood very still, and one of the other Vithali observers, an older soldier named Death, who rarely spoke, leaned toward him and said quietly, "The noise has now told every combatant in this network where we are." "Yes," Cherval said. "They will converge." "Yes." A pause. "She knows this." "Yes," Cherval said. "I'm still working out why that's all right with her." They kept moving. The second contact came 11 minutes later. Not 6 this time. 14. The insurgents had been running. Cherval could smell the exertion on them, converging exactly as predicted, drawn by the sound, moving fast and grouped because they were expecting to overwhelm a small unit with numbers in the dark. What they found was 8 humans who had stopped moving and formed a position. Cherval watched the firefight from a side passage and felt the mathematics of it rearrange in his head in real time. The insurgents had plasma cutters, lethal at 4 meters, which meant they needed to close. The humans were keeping them from closing with a weight of fire that, even understanding the mechanism, was difficult to watch calmly. The noise was total. The tunnel collected it and gave it back multiplied. His eardrums registered it as physical pressure, and the humans were fine. Not fine like trained, fine like they had practiced for this specific thing. Like the noise was calibrated to them, for them. Like they had looked at the problem of close-quarters tunnel fighting and decided that the answer was not to be quiet, but to be loud enough that the enemy cannot think. The 14 insurgents did not close the distance. Okoye's voice came through the comm. 2 minutes, then we push. Cherval looked at Death. Death looked back. In 80 years of service, Cherval had never heard a unit commander say 2 minutes as if it were a reasonable, controllable increment of time in an active firefight. It implied a level of confidence in outcome that either signaled genius or delusion, and nothing he had seen so far was pointing toward delusion. The 2 minutes passed. They pushed. The central node was 90 minutes in. By the time the human element reached it, every combatant in the network had either been engaged or routed. The noise had done exactly what Cherval predicted, converged the enemy into the human's path, and the humans had eaten them on the way through. They had not needed to hunt. They had made themselves the loudest thing underground and let the enemy come to them. He had been running the wrong calculation the entire time. The central node was a wide chamber, carved smooth, lit with Grathali work lights. 8 insurgents left. Dug in. Fortified position, plasma cutters covering every entrance. The humans stopped outside. Okoye got on the comm, and she said one word to someone who was not in the tunnel. Now. Sherval had forgotten about the surface. He had forgotten because he had been underground for 90 minutes, and his attention had been entirely on what was in front of him. And he had, in the absorbing focus of combat, completely stopped thinking about what was happening above them. Above them, on the surface. The transport helicopter that had arrived at 0300, the one with the thing mounted under it that had no entry in the Vithali military database, had been flying a holding pattern for 90 minutes at low altitude, waiting. The thing mounted under it was a 6-barreled rotary cannon, a minigun in the technical nomenclature, though the humans who built it called it the M134, and the humans who used it had other names that were shorter and more expressive. It had been designed on Earth in the 20th century, which, in Vithali reckoning, was approximately 8 of their standard generations ago, which was about as ancient as they got while still being considered tactically current. It fired at a rate of 6,000 rounds per minute, not 6,000 per hour, per minute, 100 rounds per second, each round moving at approximately 900 meters per second. His 6 barrels rotating because no single barrel could handle the heat of sustained fire at that rate. The ceiling of the Grathali tunnel network at the node chamber was approximately 4 meters of rock. Okoye had the seismic data. She had the map overlay. She had spent 12 hours while the Vithali slept doing what humans with rifles and no pulse weapons do when they are given 12 hours and a problem. They find a different solution. The minigun did not fire through the rock. It fired adjacent to it, through a ventilation shaft that the Grathali had carved for themselves, that came out 40 meters east of the chamber, and the blast pressure alone, the sustained, continuous, physically impossible to process shockwave of 6,000 rounds per minute through an enclosed stone passage, was enough. The 8 insurgents inside the central node did not fight. They came out with their hands up, their plasma cutters on the ground, making sounds that the translator drone rendered as stop and enough, and one that had no direct translation, but that the drone flagged with a note reading approximately, "We did not know what that noise was, and we never want to know." Okoye walked into the chamber. She looked at the command infrastructure, the communication gear, the maps, the operational calendar. She started pulling drives. Sherval walked in behind her and stood in the middle of the chamber and looked at the surrendered insurgents, and then at the humans, efficiently stripping everything of intelligence value, and then at Okoye. He said, in careful translated English, "You planned the noise." She looked up from a drive she was prying loose. "Yeah. You brought them to you deliberately. Tunnel acoustics are predictable." She got the drive out, pocketed it. Scared people run toward sound, because it means they're not alone. Insurgents who've been winning for 14 months run toward sound because it means a target. He was quiet for a moment, and the surface weapon was always for the node. Only way in without casualties. She moved to the next piece of equipment. Rock and ventilation, basic physics. Sherval looked at the surrendered Grathali. He looked at the chamber around him. He looked at the tunnel they had come through, and which had been cleared, not by technology, not by nano-mesh armor or atom-reducing pulse emitters, but by 8 people with rifles that had been laughed at on a tarmac 20 hours ago. He thought about the calculation he had been running, the one that had the wrong answer because it had the wrong variable. The wrong variable was, he had been calculating what the rifles could do. He had not been calculating what the people holding the rifles had decided to do. That was not a small distinction. He looked at Okoye. He opened his mouth. She was already moving past him toward the exit, drives in her pockets, the rifle across her chest in the exact same posture she had been standing in on the tarmac when he had laughed. He closed his mouth. Outside, 70 meters up through rock and ventilation and thin moon atmosphere, The helicopter was still flying its holding pattern, the minigun cooling in the dark, waiting to be needed or not needed. Either one fine. The debrief lasted 4 hours. It happened in Velketh's command post, the origami building, under cold Vithali light with 3 different levels of command present, 2 of which had patched in remotely from orbit, which meant someone up there cared about what had happened in a tunnel on Thresh tonight in ways that went beyond the operational. Okoye sat at the end of the table. Around her, the 8 soldiers who had been underground with her. Across from them, and the Vithali observer element, and at the head of the table, Velketh. Sherval sat to Velketh's right and said nothing for most of it. The intelligence haul from the drives was still being processed, but the preliminary picture was already clear enough that the staff officers in orbit were doing the things staff officers do when a mission produces better results than projected, generating paperwork to explain it. Someone had to write down what had happened. And that meant someone had to understand it first. That was harder than it sounded. Velketh ran the formal debrief methodically, going through each contact point, each decision, each outcome. His questions were specific. Okoye's answers were short. When he asked about the acoustic planning, the deliberate use of rifle noise as a herding tool, she explained it in 4 sentences. When he asked about the surface asset timing, she explained it in 3. When he asked how she had known the ventilation shaft placement without internal schematics, she said, "Grithali engineering in this region follows a consistent standard. They always vent at 40 to 60 meter intervals from the primary chamber. I measured the shaft spacing on the approach." Velketh wrote that down. Sherval looked at his notes. He looked at the debrief record. He thought about a 60-year-old instinct that had told him he understood what a battle was and how it was fought and what the variables were, and how that instinct had been incorrect tonight in ways that were small enough individually and enormous in aggregate. One of the orbital staff officers, a Vithali colonel named Veshko, whose image floated at the far end of the table from a comm projection, said, "I want to understand the surface weapon choice. Your available assets included pulse artillery at range. Why was a rotary projectile system selected?" Okoye looked at the projection. "Pulse artillery at range has a concussion radius that would have compromised the tunnel structure and potentially closed our exit routes. The minigun at close angle through the ventilation shaft produces a directional pressure wave. It doesn't bring down rock, it uses the rock as a waveguide." A pause from the projection. "You were using the rock as part of the weapon." "Yes, sir." Another pause. "Your people designed this." "Yes, sir." "The rotary weapon is how old?" "The design is from 1963 on our calendar, about 60 Earth years." The projection was quiet for a moment in a way that had texture to it, the silence of someone recalibrating something significant. Espinoza, who had survived his first tunnel engagement and was sitting at the far end of the human element and had been trying very hard to look like a veteran for the last 4 hours, caught Okoye's eye, and she gave him the smallest possible look that said, "Stay still, don't speak, we're almost through it." He stayed still. After the debrief concluded and the orbital officers disconnected, Velketh asked Okoye to remain. The room cleared until it was the 2 of them and Sherval, who had not moved. And Velketh said, "I owe you a question." Okoye waited. "On the tarmac, when my soldiers laughed, you knew about the surface asset. You knew the plan. You could have told us." It was not a question yet. Okoye let it sit. "You chose not to," Velketh said. "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because your people needed to underestimate us," she said. "Not permanently, just for long enough." Velketh tilted his head. "For what purpose?" "Because if you'd known the plan, you'd have offered to improve it, you'd have cross-referenced it against Vithali doctrine, you'd have run compatibility analyses against your own equipment, and all of that would have taken time and introduced elements that weren't part of what we already knew would work." She looked at him directly. We've been fighting wars for a lot longer than you've known us, Commander. Our doctrine is old because it works. And old things that work tend to get fixed by people who think they need fixing. Velketh was still for a moment, that storing stillness. So you allowed the mockery to protect the operation. The mockery was free. The operation was not. Cherval, who had been sitting quietly, said, "The rifle." They both looked at him. He said, "I laughed at the rifle. Specifically." Okoye said, I know. It was a reasonable assessment given available information. It usually is. He looked at the table, at his hands, 2 sets of 4-fingered hands that had fired weapons far more technically sophisticated than anything in the human armory. He looked at those hands and thought about what it meant that those hands, and the century of experience in them, had been wrong about what happened underground tonight. He said, "In Vathali, we have a word, Keth Sur All, and it means, approximately, the error of understanding a tool without understanding the hand that holds it." Okoye waited. "I made that error," he said. "Every soldier on this base made it. It is considered a significant failure in our tradition, not tactical, philosophical." The room was quiet. Velketh said, "He is saying we were fools." "No," Cherval said. "We were ignorant. A fool is someone who stays that way." Okoye looked at Cherval for a moment, then at Velketh. Then she said, "I request a joint training rotation, 30 days, mixed elements, your doctrine and ours, working from scratch." Velketh said, "You would be willing to show us your doctrine." "I'd be willing to show you what we've learned in the last 100,000 years of trying to kill each other," she said, "which includes the minigun, which includes the rifle, which includes a lot of things that look old because they are old and keep working anyway." Velketh looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Da accepted." That was the end of the formal part. What came after was not formal. The Vathali base had a common space, something between a mess hall and a gathering room, the kind of place soldiers everywhere build because soldiers everywhere need somewhere to sit with no mission requirements for a few hours. Okoye's element was there, eating compressed food and not complaining about it when the Vathali began to filter in. Not officers, not observers, enlisted soldiers. The ones who had stood on the tarmac and laughed. They came in 1s and 2s, quiet and careful, and some of them sat and some of them stood, and one of them, a young Vathali private who could not have been older than 35, which for his species was practically an infant, walked up to Espinoza and looked at the M4A1 that was leaned against the bench next to him. He said something. The nearest translator drone rendered it. "May I hold it?" Espinoza looked at Okoye. She nodded once. And he picked it up, cleared it by reflex, checked the chamber, locked it open, handed it over safe, the way he had been taught until it was below thought. The Vathali private took it with 2 of his 4 hands. He turned it slowly. He was careful with it in the way people are careful with things that they have realized they misunderstood. He looked at the barrel, the iron sights, the carrying handle. He said something. The drone translated, "It is simpler than I thought." Espinoza said, "That's kind of the point." The private looked at him. "The simpler it is," Espinoza said, "the less there is to break, and the less there is to break, the longer it keeps working. Sergeant Okoye says that's not a limitation. That's the whole design philosophy." The private held the rifle for a moment longer. Then he said, and the drone translated it with the same flat affectlessness it translated everything. "On our home world, we have a saying. A weapon that cannot be understood by its enemy is a clever weapon. A weapon that has been underestimated by its enemy is a great one." Espinoza thought about that. He said, "Huh." "Yes," the Vathali private said. He handed the rifle back, careful and two-handed, the way you hand back something you've decided to respect. In the far corner of the room, Velketh stood with Okoye. They were not talking, and they were both watching their people, his people and her people, occupy the same space with the careful, feeling each other out quality of any two groups who have just learned that they were wrong about each other in ways that matter. Velketh said, "Colonel Marsh, your commanding officer, he knew about this, the plan." Okoye said, "He built most of it. He anticipated our reaction. He's been to a lot of first meetings with allied species," she said. They usually go the same way." Velketh turned that over. "How many allied species have you met?" "In the last 40 years? 14? He looked at her. "And each of them laughed at the rifle," she said, "or something like it." The room was warm. Somewhere a Vithali soldier was attempting to explain something to Corporal Wash, who was nodding with the expression of a person who is understanding more than they are showing. Yeah, the technical crew chief who had delivered the helicopter was asleep in a corner chair, completely unconcerned. Espinosa was showing a group of 3 Vithali how to field strip the M4A1 one-handed, which was technically a party trick, but was landing as something more. Velketh said, "You have been doing this, the rifle, the mockery, the underestimation, since before we knew you existed." "Since before most people knew we existed," Okoye said. "We fought each other first, for a long time, with these." He looked at the rifle across the room, being passed from Vithali hand to Vithali hand, each one holding it differently, each one learning the weight of it. "And you survived." "Barely," she said. "Every time, barely." He was quiet. She said, "That's why the doctrine is old, because the things that got us through barely are the things worth keeping." Above Thresh, in low orbit, the debrief report was being filed. In it, and a Vithali colonel named Veshko had added a personal notation to the standard operational summary, a notation that was unusual enough that it would be flagged and reviewed by 3 levels of command above her, and would eventually be incorporated into the Joint Operations Manual that the Vithali were already talking about drafting. The notation read, "Recommend all Vithali officers be briefed on human military history prior to joint deployment. Specifically, the age of their equipment is not an indicator of its effectiveness and should not be treated as one. Recommend further, the error of Keth-Sural must be named in any future joint briefing as a known risk factor. We nearly made a fatal assessment error on the basis of technology comparison. We did not understand the hand that held the tool. This must not happen again." Below, in the common room, Espinosa handed the rifle back to his own bench, assembled and perfect. And a Vithali private who was 35 years old and learning things faster than his training had prepared him for, asked one more question. He said, "The helicopter weapon, the one that makes the—" And he made a sound with his mouth that was not a word in any language but communicated perfectly. Espinosa grinned. He could not help it. He said, "The minigun." "Yes, that. How old is it?" "Designed in 1963. And it's still—" "Yeah," Espinosa said. "So it's still—" The private was quiet for a moment. He looked at the rifle. He looked at the door beyond which, somewhere on the tarmac, a helicopter sat with a cooling rotary cannon under its belly. He said, "Your people are very strange." Espinosa said, "Yeah, we get that a lot." "It is not an insult." "I know." The private looked at him. Something moved in his mirror eyes. Not laughter this time. It's the other thing. The thing that comes after you laugh at something and then find out the thing was right all along and you were the one who was wrong, and the only honest response left is respect. He said, "I think we will learn a great deal from you." Espinosa thought about 90 minutes underground, about the noise that was the plan, about the rock that was part of the weapon, about Okoye saying the noise is part of it without explaining it, and the answer arriving in the dark on its own schedule. He said, "Yeah, probably." Outside, the moon called Thresh turned in its slow orbit. The tunnels were quiet. The helicopter held still on the tarmac. The rifle leaned against the bench. Old things, still working.